And we're live.
All right, thanks, Jamie, and welcome to everybody to the December 10th meeting, the second to last meeting of the Juvenile Justice Reform Council. We have, as usual, a very aggressive agenda, so I'm not going to spend too much time welcoming you, and we will see in your package a copy of the minutes and wait for a motion to approve those minutes.
I'd make a motion to adopt.
Okay, anyone have any changes or corrections or objections to the minutes?
No, I would
Hearing
second
none.
that.
I'm sorry?
I would second that motion.
All right.
I remember that song.
All right. So the minutes are passed, and we're going to try and go sort of fast and furious today. But we did get unfortunately, still not all of the data, but the majority of the data, minus two big jurisdictions. So we need to make sure that we have that caveat. But Selena did work tirelessly to take the data that we were able to obtain and crunch the numbers as best we could and put together, I think, a very, very robust presentation that will lead to some conversation and hopefully some good policy changes. So Selena, go ahead and take it away.
All right, thank you. 1 second, let me share my screen. Okay. Okay, so good morning, everyone. Today we are talking about some preliminary findings that we have so far on youth charged as adults in Maryland. So this presentation is split into 3 different sections, all using different data to kind of give a comprehensive picture of what we know about what's going on. The first data being presented on is data that we received from the courts on youth charged as adults in Maryland from 2017 to 2019. We did not receive all the data so far, but we did receive Baltimore City Circuit Court data and data from the MDEC counties, district and circuit courts. And so I'll go a little more into that in a second. But just to make some notes on my methodology and the limitations it might come with. So this presentation really focused on exclusionary offenses, which I go into in the next slide, that were determined as outlined by the DJS Data Resource Guide. Within those exclusionary offenses, traffic offenses are included, but I was unable to really explore those due to a lack of an efficient way of determining whether the offense was incarcerable in the data. And then I was also unable to explore this phenomenon of once an adult, always charged as an adult due to lack of an indicator in the data that captured that. The data that we received was charge level data and was restructured into youth level data. So for most of the analyses, it focuses on the top charge, and charge severity, because it wasn't noted in the data, was determined by referencing how DJS ranks offenses. And then finally, outcome analyses. So those on dispositions and sentencing are limited to circuit court data. This was because this was all we had for Baltimore City. And then for the MDEC counties, we were unable to determine the outcome for district court cases that were forwarded to circuit court due to a different case number. Okay, so with that being said, these are the exclusionary offenses that the presentation focuses on. So for young people ages 14 and older, murder in the first degree, rape in the first degree, and attempts and conspiracies of those offenses, as well as other serious violent offenses, kidnapping, assault in the first degree, carjacking and armed carjacking, murder, voluntary manslaughter, rape in the second degree, robbery or armed robbery and attempted armed robbery, and third degree sex offense. as well as all these firearm offenses that you see on the right-hand side. So going into an explanation or an overview of the data that is included, as you see, all these counties, with the exception of Baltimore City, Prince George's County, and Montgomery County, are what are referred to as the MDEC counties. So we have district and circuit court data for the MDEC counties, and then circuit court data for Baltimore City. We are missing all data for the metro region, so Prince George's County and Montgomery County, but we hope to receive that data soon. So just an overview of the profile of cases for young people charged as adults. Within the MDEC counties, there were just under 1,300 cases, average age about 16 and a half. The sample was 90% boys, 73% Black youth. 85% of these cases included an exclusionary offense, and 77% included cases where an exclusionary offense was the top charge. Going into Baltimore City, we had under 500 cases, average age, same age, 16 and a half. 95% of young people charged as adults in Baltimore City are boys, and 94% are Black youth. 93% of cases include an exclusionary offense, and in 91% of these cases, the exclusionary offense was the top charge. So briefly going over this table is not at the top charge level. It's really breaking down the percentage of young people who were charged with any exclusionary offense. And it breaks it down by age, and in cases where young people had more than one exclusionary offense, it categorizes it as the most serious. And so what you can see here is that within the MDEC counties, which had almost 1,300 cases, about 60 of them were for young people 15 and under. The majority, again, were for ages 16 and 17, and the most common offense was assault in the first degree, which accounted for about 37% of cases. This was followed by, I believe, armed robbery and handgun and firearm possession, yes. As for Baltimore City, here, about 20 of the young people in the total sample were ages 15 and under. The most common offenses in this data set were for assault as well, armed carjacking, and handgun and firearm possession. Now looking at the data in terms of the top charge as categorized by exclusionary offense. Here for the MDEC counties, you see that over a third of cases are for first degree assault. This is followed by cases for a non-exclusionary offense, but for other exclusionary offenses that were quite common are armed robbery, murder, and handgun and fire possession, each accounting for about 10%, whereas the other categories accounted for much lower percentages. And then for Baltimore City, again, you see assault is the largest category with a quarter of cases, followed by handgun and firearm possession at 20% and armed carjacking at 18%. So now looking at the percent of cases that are transferred down to juvenile court, here I'm focusing specifically on the MDEC counties because of the fact that cases in Baltimore City were so homogenous that there were so few white youth and so few girls in the data set. But in the MDEC counties, 41% of all cases with a disposition were transferred to juvenile court. You see that girls have a higher percentage of cases transferred than boys. White youth have a higher percentage than Black youth, and 16-year-olds higher than 17-year-olds. And here I focus on case dispositions, breaking down case dispositions for offenses that had at least 10 cases in the entire category. And what you see here is broken down MDEC counties in comparison to Baltimore City at the top. The top of the bar chart is all cases overall, so you can compare it to the overall rate of cases that are transferred, dismissed, convicted. The two kind of colors that I want to focus on are transferred cases, which are the bluish teal color, and then cases that are dismissed, which is the orange color. And what you can see is that across the data sets for all of the charges outlined, these two categories account for the largest percentage of dispositions. You'll see that different dispositions for the various offense categories kind of mirror each other across data sets, with the exception of carjacking and armed carjacking, where in the MDEC counties, 40% of these cases resulted in a conviction, which was much lower in Baltimore City. And then you see that the difference in handgun and firearm possession is that a much larger percentage of these cases are transferred down to juvenile court in Baltimore City in comparison to MDEC counties, whereas in the MDEC counties, these cases have a higher percentage that are dismissed in comparison to Baltimore City. And so this is just another way of visualizing the prior slide by combining cases across the two data sets to see the percent of cases that are charged in adult court that results in a conviction. Here you see that it's a pretty low percentage across categories, the highest percentage being carjacking and armed carjacking, with about a quarter of those cases being convicted, whereas first degree assault, only 5% of cases charged that had a disposition resulted in a conviction. This next slide focuses on actual sentence length. Again, MDEC counties and Baltimore City are combined in order to have a large enough number of categories to look at in terms of proportions that fall under various sentence lengths. Here, I chart the total sentence length that a person is required to serve. So their sentence minus their suspended sentence to come up with the amount of time that they're incarcerated. One thing to note is that, again, these analyses were done at the youth level, not at the charge level. So this doesn't represent all the time that a young person is required to serve, but what they're required to serve for this given category. And this also excludes the 5 cases that had a life sentence because of the difficult way of figuring out how to incorporate it into this one graph. But what you'll see here is, starting with the murder charges, these charges are the most likely to serve a lengthy sentence, with about 75% of cases resulting in 10 or more years in their sentence, whereas about 17% result in time served. You see that for carjacking, most of the sentences are between 3 years and more. And then when you get down to the lower categories on the chart, so armed robbery, assault in the first degree, and handgun and firearm possession, you see that most of these cases are resulting in an actual sentence length of 3 years or less. All cases for handgun and firearm possession are for 3 years or less for their sentence. Now going into the DJS data, these are all complaints that were transferred down to juvenile court for youth charged as adults. Different from the prior data set, this isn't at the youth level, right? This is all complaints that are transferred down during the 2017 to 2019 fiscal year period. And so the profile of this data is average age 17 years old, 93% boys, 81% Black youth, with most cases coming from Baltimore City and metro regions. About 17% of complaints transferred down to juvenile court were for misdemeanors, with 83% being for felonies. And then breaking down complaints transferred to juvenile court by charge, severity, and offense. Again, you see the majority are for felony offenses. Within misdemeanor offenses, about 3/4 of these are for a handgun violation. For felony offenses, you see, similar to what the prior data showed, the majority being for assault, felony assault, followed by robbery and then carjacking. Then exploring case dispositions for misdemeanor offenses that were transferred to juvenile court. Over half resulted in probation, whereas about 1/4 were committed to DJS. Again, you see handgun violation accounts for the vast majority of these offenses, with about half resulting in probation, 1/4 in commitment to DJS. Assault and narcotics have much lower numbers overall, with assault more than half of cases resulting in probation, whereas for misdemeanor narcotics, only about 1/3 or less than 1/3 resulted in probation, about 40% in commitment to DJS. Now for felony offenses, you'll see that about similar percentages result in probation and commitment to DJS, 42% each. And then for the most common felony offenses, again, these are felony assault, robbery, and carjacking. Felony assault and robbery have pretty similar percentages resulting in probation and in commitment to DJS, whereas carjacking, over 60% result in commitment to DJS and 1/4 result in probation. Finally, this last data set is youth charged as adults who are detained in youth facilities pending transfer hearing. And what we see here is that the average daily population in juvenile facilities pending transfer hearing has decreased slightly from 2017 to 2019, from an average of about 116 youth to 104 in 2019. The average daily population in these facilities by race and ethnicity has been over 90% young people of color every single month from 2017 to 2019. And then looking at average daily population by facility, you see that the majority of young people are in the Baltimore City Juvenile Detention Center, but this has decreased over the years, and about 20 young people a year, or about 20 young people a day on average at Cheltenham and at Charles Hickey School of Detention, whereas the other detention facilities have much lower average daily populations. And then exploring average length of stay by admission year. So the average length of stay in juvenile facilities pending transfer hearing has decreased from 2017 to 2019, but young people are still staying an average of 105 days while awaiting their transfer hearing, which amounts to about 3.5 months in 2019. Okay, I know that was a lot of information to go over pretty quickly, but I'm happy to open it up to questions and go back to whatever slides anyone has questions on.
I see Scott, but anyone else after Scott, please just speak up because I can't see everybody on the screen.
So could we go to page 12?
Yes, one second.
I think,
This one?
yes.
Okay.
So if the person was charged with armed robbery and we took a plea to simple robbery, that wouldn't have been captured on this slide? That would be considered what, dismissed?
So the data doesn't show what the plea resulted in. It just follows the original offense and shows what that resulted in. That would most likely fall under, it was still a guilty plea, right?
Well, but it wasn't a guilty plea to the charge you were looking at. So if you're looking at first-degree assault and then you see first degree assault and all pros, you don't look to count 5 to see that the person pled to simple assault. That's what
Yeah,
I'm trying to
that
figure
would be,
out.
yeah, that would be true. I
So
only look
in,
at the
in
top
every armed
part.
robbery, every carjacking, and every first degree assault, if I took a plea to a lesser charge on these numbers, that would be considered a dismissal because I would have dismissed the primary charge you're looking at and I would have pled guilty to something lesser.
Right. So in order to analyze this in a way that is clear to present, I mean, I followed the top charge method that you use for looking at the youth level. And so the decision was made to focus on these exclusionary offenses that do result in being direct filed to adult court. Unfortunately, I couldn't present on every single offense and how it results, but yes, that wouldn't be shown in this chart.
Yeah,
So I mean, I'm not criticizing because I realize how hard it would be to do this. But I would just tell the group that that's what happens in real life very, very often is you might have a top charge and you might take a plea to a lesser. And that happens in the adult system, whether they're a 60-year-old person or a 16-year-old person. So and again, I'm not criticizing. I realize this would be hard to capture, and I see what the intent was, but I just don't know that it captures everything we actually do in real life.
But
So-
Mr. Schellenberger, my note would be that those lesser included would not be exclusionary offenses. And
Right,
that-
but it could have it still could have resulted in, they could have agreed to stay up, or they could have then said, well, let's go back down to juvenile.
yes. So Scott, I think you point out a shortcoming of the analysis that we could not control for. And as you said, charges could be dropped down. And I think we see that, where you see, the top line where you see the murder first, second, and attempt, you see a lot of cases that are dismissed there on that line. And our suspicion is that a lot of those cases are dismissed, but because there is a assault, you see a lot of assault first degrees in there, that could also explain that same sort of phenomenon. They dismiss the top charge and go down to a lesser charge, and you may get a conviction for. So I think that looking at this chart, probably the most important data is the percentage of cases that are transferred. And that did result in a transfer, and I think we can get some good information there.
I also think Mr. Schellenberger's point is really important because it shows that there may be a lot of overcharging, right? If there's this high level of dismissals or transfers down, it shows that potentially lots of people are pleading to lesser charges that would not be exclusionary.
This is Betsy. I also think on this slide, it's important to note the relatively smaller proportion of adult interventions, of the guilty finding, and then later when we see the sort of the sentencing information.
Yeah, I think the sentencing information probably needs to be looked at together with this as well, because where you do see those guilty findings and you want to look at those dispositions and see what happened, that gives a more robust picture. Any other comments? I'm sorry, Ms. Egan, I see you. Go ahead.
I would love to look at the next slide, 13. This is, I just wanted to say, this is the slide that was just jaw-dropping for me last night when I first saw it. That we are charging more than almost 1,000 kids a year as adults, and it's resulting in these very low percentages of conviction and sentencing in adult court. It's a dramatic figure to know that only 16% of kids charged with murder end up being sentenced as such in adult court. That means 84% are not being found guilty and given sentence. This is a huge 95% for assault first degree. This is a dramatic finding. We are charging thousands of kids, 1,000 kids a year, and the vast majority of them don't end up being sentenced in an adult court. I wanted to underscore.
Go ahead, Scott.
So if someone was charged with, say, first degree murder based on what we call felony murder, and they pled to carjacking, you would have only tracked the murder, the top charge, the murder conviction. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah, it
So there
just
there
includes
could
the
be
top
some
charge.
people out. So, I mean, and Ms. Egan, I'm sure you'll have an answer because you're pretty smart. You always get me. If two people commit say, armed carjacking and someone gets killed, they can be charged with felony murder, which is first degree murder. If one gets convicted of the felony murder and the other pleads guilty to the carjacking, the second one wouldn't have been captured because that wasn't the first count that you had captured on that person.
I think that's accurate.
Okay,
Dr.
we agree on
Cordes?
something, Jenny.
Yeah,
Good.
it's just the nature of court data. There's plenty of offenses, and yeah,
Yeah,
unfortunately,
no, I understand it.
show all.
I get asked every day I got a media inquiry today about data, and it is so hard for us to generate data in the criminal system. So I am not criticizing, I'm just trying to find out.
Is it possible to characterize the convictions, attach it to the whole case rather than to that specific offense? In the analysis that we do on the juvenile court side, that's the way we do it. We characterize the case based on the most serious offense that came in, and then whether there was a, whatever the adjudication was for that case and the disposition, it might not have been for that most serious offense, but it was for that case.
Yeah, I mean, there would be a way to do that. It would just take a lot longer. And there was so little time to do these analyses. There's a lot that can be done with this data. It just, with the time constraints, it wasn't able to be done for this.
Yeah, I think Mr. Schellenberger is right. I still think the data tells a very important story, right? Like, you can always find exceptions to the data, but that doesn't mean that these overall trends, like 95% of assault firsts, don't tell a very significant story. And I would just note that he mentions felony murder, which is one of the reasons Maryland was rated the worst human rights offenders for kids in the criminal legal system, was because we allow for the fiction of felony murder to be applied to children. So there's lots of complicated stuff in the data, but I still think even with those exceptions, these numbers tell a very overwhelming story. So even if that was for 10% of cases weren't reflected in the data, it would still be the overwhelming more than 3/4 of these cases not being sentenced in adult court.
And I think it also speaks to some of this, just in terms of who the decision maker is, that with the statutes that some states have that are presumptive waiver, where it's presumed that the youth will be transferred, but it's happening in juvenile court, that's an appealable decision. When it's happening based on just the prosecutor's charging level, that's what you end up with, this kind of situation. And when the statute also includes the lesser offenses, that's why you end up with data like this.
I just want to raise the point of, I guess, in the data, the disproportionate number of Black men that are being charged as adults, and not just in Baltimore City, but in jurisdictions where they're not the majority. They cannot be the only ones that are committing these offenses. I look at first degree assault and the number of, and just first degree assault, those who are committing first degree assault and being charged as adults. So I think that's something we really need to think about. Where's the implicit bias in the system? And it's not surprising, but it should floor all of us.
Yeah.
I just wanted to pick up on that from Ms. Chapman, thank you, is that this is also missing Prince George's County and Montgomery County, which have higher levels of disproportionality than the rest of the state. So I think if we were to plug that data in, the disproportionality statewide would be even higher, close to 90% across the state.
Well, I don't know about the how it comes out with the data we don't have, but I think, yeah, Ms. Chapman, you make a good point in that looking at the MDAC counties, which is, sort of everywhere else except for, Metro, which is Prince George's, Montgomery County, and Baltimore City. Wow, it's still almost 90% boys and 73% Black. Those are very high numbers, and as you point out, not in majority, minority, or a majority of people of color communities. You would think there'd be more of a gap there. I think that as we're seeing this information, it does beg the point or make the point that we need more time with this data. There are other ways to analyze the data we have that have been brought up. That we also have missing data still, and I don't want to sort of cut this conversation off because I think it's important. But we do have some other things on the agenda. So I wanted to pause for a moment, and I know we have a representative from GoCap, and at the last meeting we talked about trying to form a recommendation around these data issues that we have and how we can more routinely capture this information. And I know I didn't give you guys much time, and I'm going to do a mea culpa. I was supposed to confer with Director Houston and never got a chance to do that. But Jessica, do you have any updates on that by any chance? And sorry to put you on the spot.
No, it's fine. I apologize too for my camera quality here, having technical issues, but we have discussed this internally with our data team, and they are the folks that pull together the CGIS report that was mentioned during the last meeting. And they are certainly interested in further exploring this analysis that we were just discussing, and think this is something that they could take on. So they want to keep that conversation moving with additional analysis, and they're open to working with this group to do that.
Okay, and just for everybody's knowledge, what I've asked our team working on this is to be very specific about what we would need, what's missing in the data, what needs to be collected, where it should be housed, and try to work with GoCap to come up with a recommendation. I realize we only have one more meeting left, but I want to be as specific as we can and not just have a sort of general recommendation that we should collect this data, which has been recommended many, many times before, but to drill down on what's really missing, what needs to be done, and where it should go. And so we'll bring that to you hopefully in the final meeting that we have. Are there any other questions about this youth charged as adults presentation or comments before we move on?
Well, I would just add to the comment about collecting more data is that some of it needs to be made public. It can't just be data that you possess. It has to be out there for the community so they can see how the system works and how their money's being spent.
Certainly, and I'm glad that you mentioned that. I think we publish all of our data, and I think that GoCap has a history of publishing data and certainly a desire to be a repository of that kind of information. So absolutely, and we'll be explicit about that as well.
I have one more question about methodology. So I'm curious, Baltimore City is not an MDAC jurisdiction, and neither is Montgomery and Prince George's. How is it we were able to get information from Baltimore City, but not Montgomery and Prince George's? I'm just trying to figure out what the differences are or who's capturing the numbers.
Yeah, I think Betsy spoke to that right before the meeting, and she could probably give a better explanation than me, but it just seemed like Baltimore had their data in a ready to go format much quicker than Prince George's and Montgomery.
We've worked with Baltimore City, and we've done deep dives in the youth charged as adults subset of data as part of our JDAI collaborative in the city. So we've done some deep dives already. We've gotten data from state's attorney's office to get case data, and so we've had some experience there. I think there was some conversation at the beginning of the meeting, or perhaps before we went live, about that they have, and probably have one of the oldest, if not the oldest, sort of electronic data systems. So they've been collecting data longer than a lot of other jurisdictions. So they're just a little bit further ahead on that than some of the other jurisdictions. All right.
Sam, can I make a comment real quick?
Yes, go ahead, Mr. Ford.
Yeah, also, I just wanted to remind people on the impact of the race and ethnic disparities. According to the Juvenile Justice Reform Act, we have to make movement as a state in this area, or it could impact our ability to obtain federal funds for programming that will help divert, some of these actions. So I just wanted to, put that back on the table, that some movement, some changes have to be made, or it could impact federal funding and our compliance with the JJRA.
Yep, that's a good point. And that sort of goes to the location of where kids are housed. And I think there are some probably larger takeaways from the data that we do have. A lot of kids get transferred back to the juvenile system. I think that much is clear. Dispositions, when we look at sentencing, a lot of the sentencing, and I don't think we explained this, but we broke it out by up to 18 months because those are the typical sentences you'd see folks get in a jail sentence rather than a prison sentence. And sort of marking that distinction, between the longer sentences that people get for other felonies. So I think there are some takeaways. We obviously have a lot of work that needs to be left to do in understanding the issue and coming to recommendations. But there is a lot of data out there to look at right now. And as I said at the beginning, we still do have one more meeting, and I know that we are going to be drafting recommendations. But I will be open to, recommendations that we could possibly make based on the information that we have. So that's still out there. But we do also have on our agenda today minimum age of jurisdiction and diversion recommendations. If you recall, in our one of our earlier meetings, in fact, I think it was the first meeting that we tried to vote on a recommendation. This was the recommendation that we voted on. It appeared to pass, and then I realized it did not. And we decided to table it and take some more time to develop that. So I wanted to move on to that topic. And I will also note, Jamie, I neglected to do the roll call or to call on you to do the roll call. Can we do that if there is a motion to vote on something and do the roll call, or do we need to do that separate from any motions?
It's totally up to you. I've been tracking people as they've been coming into the room, but however you'd like to do it.
I think we'll do it upon a motion. That way we only have to do it that one time. So
sure.
With that, I want to open discussion, and there are some language. Betsy, do you want to lead that?
Sure, I can kick it off. Would it be helpful for me to put it on the screen, because you did just receive this recommendation this morning? So Jamie, if you can let me share, I think if I can find where I have my other Zoom, I think I should be able to do that.
Yeah, it should be enabled for you.
Okay, so I think now you probably see like 3 of me. Let me find the right document. All right, can someone tell me if is it there?
It's there.
Okay, great. So just sort of wanted to start out with taking us back to September when we first discussed this issue. And I went back and listened to the meeting. So it is definitely my intention to be as accurate as possible when sort of going back to that meeting. But if you recall, Senator West, you made a motion to consider juvenile court jurisdiction starting at the age of 12, and except for crimes of violence. So that means at the age of 12, juvenile court jurisdiction would be there for all delinquent acts, but under 12, there would be an exception if the young person was charged with a crime of violence. That motion failed. And then after that motion, I made a motion to consider juvenile court starting at the age of 13 with an exception for the kids under 13 for life without the opportunity for parole crimes, which was way more limited than the previous motion by Senator West. That motion also failed. So in an attempt to sort of find that middle ground where, you know, the feeling sort of from the council was that maybe the first motion was a little over-inclusive and the second being a little under-inclusive, Ms. Egan and I sort of worked through some language and wanted to present this to the council. So I'll walk you through it. First bullet just basically states that there is no juvenile court jurisdiction for kids under the age of 10. And then for kids who are 10, 11, and 12, there would be limited jurisdiction, but for a list of specific crimes that you see listed here. When developing exceptions or list of crimes, I do try to reference other things that exist in Maryland. So this list is looking at violent crimes that have an offense severity level of 1 or 2 as indicated by the Maryland Sentencing Commission. So that would include crimes punishable by life, which is your first degree murders and all variations of that, rape in the first degree, sex offense in the first degree. And then we included some very high level severity child abuse crimes, murder in the second degree, armed carjacking, rape in the second degree, sex offense second degree, and then sex offense a continuing course of conduct. Those would be the exceptions where the juvenile court would have jurisdiction for 10, 11, and 12-year-olds. And then general jurisdiction in juvenile court would start at the age of 13 for any delinquent act as defined by the code, which right now is defined as any a crime if committed by an adult. So that's the explanation of the recommendation. Jenny, did you have anything you wanted to add that I may have missed?
Nope.
Okay, so I mean, this is sort of the hopefully the middle ground between the two sort of failed motions from September. And you know, any thoughts, any comments, or anyone want to move it?
Do you need a second?
I'm sorry, what was that?
I said, do you need a second? I think Betsy moved it, right, Betsy? I'll second it.
Okay.
I was just explaining the recommendation, but I'm happy to move it, and I'll make a motion to accept this recommendation.
Is there discussion?
Yes, please, Chairman Clippinger.
Why was manslaughter left off?
I just pulled the severity offenses for 1s and 2s. I believe that's a 3. Let me just pull it up. I have it handy on my other computer screen. Oh, I'm sharing this screen. So let me stop sharing this real quick so I can just look at my computer.
I guess the questions will be, you know, I'm looking at those crimes that we presently allow to be charged as adults, and I'm kind of doing a cross-reference, and I can see where child abuses are getting added in. Abduction and kidnapping are off, and that doesn't bother me quite as much. The ones that are left off that give me some pause are manslaughter and armed robbery. But I'd like to at least have a conversation about armed robbery.
And I would add third degree sex offense. Third degree sex offense.
I'm sorry, third degree sex offense is missing too.
So manslaughter is a offense category severity level of 4, carries a 10-year penalty, and robbery, unarmed, and robbery. Robbery is an offense severity 4 or 3, depending on the variation of it. And then, I'm sorry, Mr. Schellenberger, did you say sex offense?
In the third degree. So it'd be 3307, third degree sex offense, which can be committed by employing or showing a dangerous weapon and engaging in sexual conduct. So, I mean, you know, That's why that 23 list is there. The legislature has come up with a list of 23 places where where you can charge a 16 or 17-year-old as an adult. It seems to me we should be consistent in the law and track it the same way.
Well, except that in a manslaughter case, there's not a ton of scienter, and we're talking about juveniles whose the neuroscience tells us, don't have fully formed brains. So I'm all for leaving manslaughter off.
Yeah, we're talking about 10-year-olds. I wanted to back up that point. I've had armed robbery charges where the weapon for the 10-year-old has been a rock, and the thing stolen has been a game card, a Pokemon card, literally. And so I do think when we're talking about 10-year-olds, what manslaughter and what the mens rea for manslaughter means for a 10-year-old is very nebulous compared to that of a 16 or a 17-year-old.
So I think Delegate Clippinger and I were focusing on the 11, 12-year-olds who commit some of those other offenses.
Yeah, it's 10, 11, and 12 is the age range we're looking at with those exceptions.
Right. So, I mean, what I'm saying is we're not even going to bring a 12-year-old into juvenile court, which doesn't follow them to when they're an adult, when they've committed a third-degree sex offense with a weapon. We're not going to do anything.
I don't think the argument is that people won't do anything, right? The argument would be that is when an 11-year-old commits offense like that the proper system to deal with them is the Department of Social Services, which is probably accurate. If you're thinking about an 11-year-old committing those offenses, the science around it is very clear that the majority of those kids have been recently victimized themselves.
So am I perhaps interpreting an amendment to include manslaughter, third-degree sex offense, and robbery? Is that what we're discussing here?
My question was more about armed robbery. I would say Ms. Egan has said multiple times, and has raised an example. I'm going to go away from the example she just used of the Pokemon card and the rock, but let's just go to the straight up Pokemon card just was taken from another person forcefully, and then they're charged with a robbery. I don't know that those, given that I think the universe of those kids is relatively small, I'm not as fired up about the robbery. I'm wondering about the armed robbery more than the robbery. And that leads me also to what State's Attorney Schellenberger was saying about third-degree sex offense. That concerns me a little bit more. And I'm listening on manslaughter. I take the point on the mens rea argument on manslaughter, and we're talking about kids who are 10, 11, and 12. It just kind of hits me in a weird place. I guess the other one that I'm looking at on my list here, I think armed carjacking is right to remain on there. Carjacking is not on there, and that kind of hits me in a weird place too, but maybe in a little more of a weird place than the manslaughter does.
Okay, any other comments or thoughts, recommendations?
I just wanted to echo Jenny's sentiment that we've been trying to stress throughout this process that young people who commit these crimes are victims themselves, and they have been traumatized. So, when you take a trauma-informed approach, it's not what's wrong with the young person, but what happened to them. And what we're saying is that the data and research shows that these young people are best suited to be dealt with in juvenile facilities and or through the Department of Social Services, because they're victims themselves. So I just wanted to echo that point, that we have to focus on what is causing these young people to commit these crimes and not just take this punitive approach. to lock them up and throw away the key.
Okay. Well, it seems that, go ahead, Betsy. You have
So
comment?
I'm not sure the best procedural way, maybe Jamie can help us. I mean, I don't have any issue with including the 3rd-degree sex offense in my original motion or on this sort of list that we had in front of us. So I don't know if we can if I can amend my motion to include that, if that's the appropriate way, or maybe we can just do that.
If you want to agree to an amendment, I think that's fine. Betsy, if you could put your screen back up, add what you are agreeing to, and let's all see it.
Remind me what's in that 3rd-degree sex offense category?
I think Scott can do that while I pull this up.
So unfortunately, it's very complicated. A 3rd-degree sex offense can be committed many different ways, but it involves sexual contact. So that would mean touching an intimate body part of another. And you can do it in several ways: by using a dangerous weapon, by suffocating, strangling, or causing serious physical injury, by threatening to place the victim in fear that there will be suffocation, death, or serious visual injury, or committing the offense while aided and abetted by another. So if there were 3 12-year-olds who attacked a young girl in school, that would constitute a 3rd-degree sex offense. And all I'm saying at this point is, let's bring those folks into juvenile court. Although I do agree with Delegate Clippinger about manslaughter, someone is dead, and also about robbery. You know, you can be pulled out of, you can be robbed by 3 people without a weapon, and that can be a pretty harrowing event. And again, we're just talking about going to juvenile court. So I think Delegate Clippinger was focusing on a couple of good charges. And just to make it clear, the first bullet, I can agree to. I just think that this should be a little more inclusive of some of the other charges.
Okay, that's where we stand now. So armed robbery is, I think, the sort of sticking point we're at. I feel like there's consensus on under 10 years old, eliminating those cases from coming in. I think that would be a big move forward. And we're around the armed robbery issue. I know there are other considerations, but what about adding that, Betsy?
Yeah, I think we can. I still have some concerns given the, the brain science and, really trying to sort of follow some of the guidance we already have from the Sentencing Commission and focusing on sort of those most violent and severe acts. To build consensus, I think we can include the armed robbery. I still think we're making a lot of great progress here. But with concerns that, the armed robbery can still be a really large sort of category of offenses that really get at a lot of conduct, right? So if you use Miss Egan's example of the rock and the Pokemon card, I'm wondering if there's to even try to find more middle ground, armed robbery with a weapon, with a handgun, just trying to see if there's any ability to build some consensus to limit it to really the actions that we're sort of, I think, thinking about when we include armed robbery.
If I could just
and
address.
Just as a question, just like, so, because I, as a non-lawyer, sort of going through this, so a 12-year-old or 11-year-old is with a group of 15-year-olds and they commit an armed robbery, and he's with them, and he's also holding a weapon, that he could be charged in that case if we have this exclusion, or even if one of them had a weapon and he was with them, that would be an armed robbery. I'm asking to understand this point because of the nature of like picturing I have a 10-year-old, so this is a tough subject. So picturing the 10-year-old who's hanging out with other kids and something awful like this happens, is that the more likely scenario even that would be an armed robbery?
Well, I would have to prove that he was an aider and abetter. So typically you have to prove some participation. I mean, it's all fact specific. I mean, that's the problem.
I mean, but getting down to it, armed robbery, it's, robbery is taking the property of another with force, and then armed robbery, it is using a weapon, so the force is sort of more specific. It's not just like, let me, grab this and yank it out of your hands or threaten to do something harmful. Armed robbery would be something with a weapon on top of it.
And don't just focus on a gun. It could be a knife, which would be easily accessible.
It could also be a stick, which I've seen charged as armed robberies. It can also be an umbrella, which I've seen charged as an armed robbery. It could be a rock, which I've seen charged as an armed robbery. All of those I've seen children under the age of 13 charged with. So we have to also consider that overcharging can be used to then draw kids who should not be in the juvenile system into it. I wanted to note one part of our big discussion about this the last time was the Macarthur juvenile competence study. It's the largest study of young people related to competency in the court. And it found that young people ages 11 to 13 were more than 3 times as likely as young adults to be seriously impaired on the evaluation of competence relevant abilities. And that juveniles aged 14 to 15 were twice as likely as young adults to be seriously impaired. What we need to remember is that the majority of these kids that we're talking about are not competent to stand trial. They don't understand the juvenile system. They don't understand what it means to be found guilty. They literally don't understand their rights to remain silent because they are 5th graders who, when told by adults to tell the truth, believe that they are compelled and must comply with authority. We are talking about elementary school and middle school children. And I just wanted to point that out. I also want to point out that the floor for juvenile, for prosecuting kids in the juvenile system under the UN Convention on Children's Rights, which the US is the only signatory who has not ratified, the only member of the UN who has not ratified that treaty, the floor there for all crimes is 12. I just wanted to keep that context, which was like we're debating and compromising, but we strayed from those real fundamental things that we talked about months ago.
Mr. Chairman, I have a question.
Okay, Chairman Clippinger and then Ms. Davis.
I guess sort of following on with Ms. Egan's comments, do we have any data that shows how many times juveniles 10 to 12 were charged with manslaughter? I guess it's the top count. So manslaughter, not armed carjacking, but just carjacking, or armed robbery.
The answer is yes, we do have that data, and I will try to get it for you while we're having this discussion. So manslaughter, carjacking, and what was the last one?
Armed robbery. Not robbery, but armed robbery, and not armed carjacking. Just manslaughter, armed robbery, and carjacking. And my suspicion is that it is maybe a 2-digit number.
We do have that in the DRG, Secretary. I just need to probably check with John real quick to see if I can break out that robbery and armed robbery.
Yeah, just ask John to pull that and give us the
and
number.
just give me a few minutes, okay?
That's fine. I guess one of the thoughts that I had is to maybe at least would address my concerns is I think that the categories that are presently listed, they make sense to me. The 3 that I just listed, to be honest, the armed robbery category, if it were perhaps somehow narrowed not to include an umbrella or a rock. I could see that. But I also don't think we're talking about a lot of people. I don't think we're talking about a lot of kids. And I don't know that we need to drag this out too long over categories of here that really are not that don't have that many. That argument, I guess, could play both ways, because I think I can hear Mr. Schellenberger saying, well, these are the most extreme examples, and we need to keep a closer eye on those people. I think, you know, I kind of wondered as I was sitting here whether we wanted to include some language just in the recommendations that said that we had considered those three as potentially being ones that would be covered as being able to be charged as juveniles. But maybe we needed more information about how many people were actually covered in those areas. But since Betsy is incredibly efficient in getting that information already, maybe that wouldn't work. But I was trying to find a way forward where you could leave those three as an issue to be dealt with by the legislature.
Okay, I see where you're going there. To give a flexible recommendation in order to get one out. Before we get to that, I know I recognized Ms. Davis. You wanted to speak?
Yeah, actually, my comment was right on the heels of that. And it seems like if you're talking about a knife or a gun, that kind of shows more intent than does an umbrella or a stick or a rock. That's more of an impulsive kind of grab what's there decision that kids often make. So if we were to go forward with it, I really would like to see those issues, the knife and the stick and anything else that's clearly an impulsive act, be not included in that. So
is it possible to just have, and Rosemary, you're right up next. Is it possible to say armed robbery only with a knife or gun, or is that too sloppy? I'm asking Betsy or one of our
I think you would probably have to say deadly weapon or firearm in order to sort of be able to find definitions that exist already in our criminal code. So it'd be an armed robbery that included the use of a deadly weapon or firearm, I think is the way you would want to state that.
Okay, I think that's something to consider.
May I just ask a question? So I've been sitting here, this is Senator Carter. I was thinking about that as well over the last few minutes, and my concern about saying deadly weapon is that the interpretation of a deadly weapon, these items that Ms. Egan mentioned, can be interpreted as a deadly weapon because they are used in the commission of an assault or robbery. So I think it's too broad to say deadly weapon. I think you need to specify handgun and handgun or knife if that's what the intention is.
I agree with you, Senator Carter. Deadly weapon can be also a broad category that includes a lot of different elements. Lots of different things can be a deadly weapon depending on how you use it. So it is broader, I think, than just saying knife. I think we can maybe I'm just trying to think of how to sort of categorize knife given our sort of current statutory construction, but give me a minute and I'll think about it.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to say that I really liked Chair Clippinger's idea of putting a pin in the addition of those three and just voting at minimum on this list.
Okay, I will, well, let's consider moving that forward if that's the will of the council. And I would say that I think that does move us forward. I think there's still positive gain to be had from that. So Betsy, I know you're working on 6 different drafts right now. But the last one that Chairman Clippinger gave us, which was to include those three categories as maybes or as considerations for the legislature.
Yeah, and just so I have it clear, Chairman Clippinger, it was armed robbery,
Right.
manslaughter.
Armed robbery, manslaughter, and carjacking, not armed carjacking.
Okay.
And I will say I am happy to talk to anybody and everybody about. I think that Senator Carter raises some good points. I mean we need to, if we can flesh that out maybe before next week somehow, maybe we can figure it out. But in the meantime, I think to keep us moving, putting a pin in those three and punting it to the legislature, I don't think is a bad option.
I like that option as well, Mr. Chairman. So we will, Betsy, when you're done, just make it I guess, the amended motion and share it real quick with the group. And I think it's
so I have third-degree sex offense already listed in the sort of offenses we discussed, and I'll put this back up on the screen in a second. And then the council considered the following acts for potential inclusion.
for further consideration by the legislature.
Thank you. That's what I was looking for. Okay, hold on. All right, I'll be back in a minute.
Okay.
I just want to flag for the purposes of discussion that accomplice liability applies to 10 and 11-year-olds. So when you're talking about armed robbery with a weapon or armed robbery with a deadly weapon, say a 16-year-old is babysitting the 11-year-old, as we have seen happen recently, and the 16-year-old has a BB gun and the 11-year-old opens the door or as told to by the 16-year-old, assists and aids and abets. All of this would continue to leave a 10, 11, and 12-year-old being charged with armed robbery.
Just one other note, just for people's education, in many of our communities, many of our students carry protection just for their own protection. And so, when things happen, and just know that that's on them, whether it's a knife, something else. So just FYI, as you're thinking through this.
Okay. Betsy, if you need a couple more minutes, should we move to the next item? No, she's ready.
No, I'm just about to throw this up on the screen. So let me just do that.
Okay, there we have it. This is the amended, it's still being amended motion. I'm going to count the motion and second already in place. And Jamie, if you could call the roll for the vote.
Sure. Senator Smith. Senator Carter.
Yes.
Senator West.
Yes.
Delegate Clippinger.
Yeah.
Delegate Jackson. Delegate Pippy. Secretary Green. Ms. Tolentino.
Yes.
Mr. Kimmerer.
Yes.
Ms. Egan.
Yes.
Judge Stamm.
Abstain.
Ms. Douglas.
Yes.
Dr. Gilball.
Yes.
Dr. Lawson.
Yes.
Dr. Stickman.
Yes.
Mr. Bayless.
Yes.
Deputy Commissioner Sullivan,
Yes.
Mr. Schellenberger,
Yes.
Ms. Davis,
Yes.
Ms. Mandel, Mr. Dodson,
Yes.
Ms. Handy,
Yes.
Mr. Campbell,
Yes.
Ms. Chapman,
Yes.
Mr. Fonseca,
Yes.
Mr. Secretary, with Mr. Houston out, would you like to allow Ms. Wheeler to vote?
If she's comfortable voting, yes. She's his representative, yes.
Yes. Yes? Okay. Ms. Johnston,
No.
Mr. Ford,
Yes.
and Deputy Secretary McGlone,
Yes.
and Secretary Abed.
Yes.
And that is 1 abstention, 1 no, and the remainder are affirmative.
Okay. Thank you. And that concludes this item. And let's go ahead and move on to diversion recommendations. We did receive recommendations from the public defender and from a group, the People's Commission to Decriminalize Maryland. So in our tradition, we have our sponsors, or the folks that on the members of the council that presented can present their recommendations. I would ask, so I think, Nate, are you going to be presenting the diversion recommendations for that group?
Yes.
Okay. And Jenny, you have recommendations from the public defender's office?
Yes, but they mirror and are very close to one another.
Okay, so Jenny, would you mind then going first? And you know, I know there's a lot of material in here. If you could sort of be brief, or as brief as you can. I don't want to exclude what you want to say. And let's get to the recommendations and see what we can get through.
I'm just going to go, I'll be as brief as possible and get straight to the recommendations because I think that we had a great data presentation and we know that diversion is very critical and important. Our recommendations are first to eliminate status offenses, violations, and child in need of supervision from the juvenile causes section of the Maryland Code. Maryland should remove these provisions and replace it with language clarifying that if young people engage in these non-criminal behaviors, they should be referred to social service agencies. And that we should set up a means to do that. Prison should never be, and cages should never be the backstop for kids who need help or commit status offenses. Our number 2 recommendation is that currently in COMAR, COMAR defines delinquent act in the education code to exclude common minor school misbehavior. So the COMAR 13A080115 sorry, I have to, says that a delinquent act does not include those things which are commonly handled by school in school disciplinary hearings. What we know is that a lot of cases in Maryland result from minor misbehavior at school, and I simply, the recommendation is simply to codify that in statute because it is not enforceable and not very often referenced because it's in the education code of COMAR. So it would create a clarification that minor school misbehavior, a fight at school, for example, does not have to result in a criminal referral and is actually not delinquent behavior. Number 3 would be to revise the definition of delinquent act to exclude children under 13 and under. We've done, we've made that motion. So I think 3 is moot. Number 4 is the big recommendations. And so there's 5 there that would expand the use of informal adjustment by DJS. The first one, 4A, would require informal adjustment of all first and second time misdemeanors and all nonviolent felonies. 4B would eliminate the requirement of victim consent for an informal adjustment to proceed. Victim consent is not required to divert adults from the criminal justice system. It shouldn't be used to force youth into a system that's likely to leave them and public safety worse off than if they were not diverted to a community-based program. I'll also say experientially, often DJS can't get in contact with complaining witnesses in these cases because the complaining witnesses may not want to go forward or don't know anything. Too often that results because they don't consent in the case being forwarded. So sometimes the way that the statute is worded, the complaining witnesses who are least interested in going forward are the ones who have their cases pushed and formalized. 4C is to eliminate the requirement that DJS forward all felony complaints to the state's attorney for review and approval. Nonviolent felonies should be exempt from this exception from this requirement. 4D is to give judges explicit authority to return a case that has been petitioned back to intake for informal adjustment. Currently, the bench cannot do that. So we would give judges more autonomy to send cases back for informal adjustment. 4E is, I don't know what's happening with Delegate Clippinger, but it looks really exciting. 4E is to create explicitory statute framework for the use of citations and misdemeanor offenses that allow police citations to be resolved through police diversion or complaints to DJS. Number 5 is to standardize and expand options for community-based diversions prior to referral to DJS. So we'd like to refer pre-arrest or post-arrest diversion. And 5A is to require the Attorney General to issue a directive that standardizes the use of diversion by law enforcement agencies. I actually would amend that in my written or in my spoken word. I think that GOCAP is probably the more appropriate agency to issue standards for diversion by law enforcement agencies in Maryland. And B is to create a program similar to California's Youth Reinvestment Grant to provide resources to community-based organizations and localities to develop pre-arrest and post-arrest, but pre-referral diversion programs. Number C is to add incentive structures that provide funding to localities that refer youth to community-based diversion options instead of forwarding their cases to DJS. And 5D would require DJS to collect, publish, and evaluate access to, use of, and effectiveness of all diversion programs.
All right, Jenny, thank you for sharing those. Nate, what I was thinking is if you wanted to go over any recommendations that differed from what Jenny already shared and highlight those. And you're muted right now.
I think, yeah, sorry. I think our recommendations very closely mirror that. And just to be clear, I'm doing this on behalf of the recommendations were jointly pulled together by the Maryland Youth Justice Coalition, which I'm a member, or the Annie Casey Foundation is a member of, and the People's Commission to Decriminalize Maryland. They so closely mirror, I think, what Ms. Egan was just going through. The one thing I will say is just last week, the Attorney General's Office of New Jersey came out with even more forceful recommendations for the state and to their local prosecutors' offices and police jurisdictions that are all about a presumption of diversion, essentially. And that not that there wouldn't be cases that couldn't move through into juvenile court, but it is sort of rooted in the research and what they're understanding, going through a similar type of task force in New Jersey and coming out with a very strong recommendation to expand the use of diversion statewide. So I think that part there, the idea of whether that should come from Maryland's Attorney General's office, I'm not sure, but I think there's a lot of power of it coming from that office within the state. But otherwise, I think we can move forward with what Ms. Egan presented.
Okay, Scott, go ahead. You have a question.
So Ms. Egan, just a couple of clarifications. when you mentioned that they can get diverted before they get to DJS, who would do that? Would that be the police agency? I mean, we have a joints program in the county.
Yeah, so it depends on the locality. That's why we would want GoCap to develop those standards and push them out. Best practices is for police to refer to diversion programs, but for community-led programming and community-based programs who have expertise in young people and in development to administer those programs, which is why the recommendations in 5 are to create funding structures and incentives to allow counties and cities to develop those programs. But yeah, it's police would be referring to those. So it's a sort of either pre-arrest so that police could, refer to them without having to take them into custody or put them in cuffs, or post-arrest, but pre-referral to DJS. So it's sort of both at both junctures.
Okay, thank you for that. And then the second question is, I don't know if we can put these up on the screen, but there was one where first time offense for a misdemeanor gets diverted. So let me ask you, 15-year-old who does an assault, but just a regular assault and battery, not a first degree assault, that one can't even go to juvenile court?
That's our proposal, that should go to diversion, right? That doesn't mean, and part of that is for a number of reasons. What we know about the research is that the quicker there are consequences, diversion doesn't mean no consequences, right? It actually means often that a child would have informal supervision, that they would be engaged in programming, that they could be sent to anger management or CBT, all of the sort of things that we know. The great part about diversion is that those things happen sooner. Maybe not without probation, but that doesn't mean that they don't get services and that those things aren't addressed. In fact, diversion means that often those issues are addressed sooner and in a more sure way than court, which requires a beyond the reasonable doubt standard and all of those things. But yes, a 15-year-old who got in a fight or had a second degree assault would be diverted under this statute.
So,
and that would be just for the first offense. What if there was a second?
My proposal is that the first and second misdemeanor would result in diversion, but I'm sure that will be amended.
all right. Yeah. Okay. This is fun for some of our members here. Before we go any further, though, I just want to acknowledge that it's nearly 10:30. There are a number of recommendations here, and we got these last night. I did ask Betsy to try to rework some of the language and consolidate if we could. And this is typically what we do in the interim between the next meeting, but we're up against the wall. So Betsy, can you share your screen on some of the language that we looked at and how we can consolidate some of these or rework some of them to simplify the language and sort of get to the policy matters?
I'm curious why we're in such a hurry now that they're extending us and we're going to keep working on these things. I mean, I understand the legislature's coming up, but you get something last night and I'm really just looking at it and hearing it now, and we're now in a hurry. I know I think we've accomplished a lot. So.
No, and look, I'm not, Scott, I'm not trying to rush it. I don't know about extending the council. I haven't heard about that. I think the legislature would have to weigh in. I'm just mindful of the volume of recommendations between the public defenders and the People's Commission or the coalition's recommendations. And I think that there are some areas that we could move on. I'm not proposing that we look at everything in great detail because I don't think we do have time for all of it. So I'm trying to highlight some things that we may have time to look at. If we don't, we don't.
I just wanted to clarify my point for Mr. Schellenberger as Betsy pulls that up. I would also say that if under the statute and the current diversion or current statute, if a child failed diversion, they would still get referred to court. So this would require a referral to diversion, but that doesn't mean that the kid may not end up in court if that doesn't work out.
So I pulled this up. I want to just sort of take something off. we've already voted as a recommendation to have that sort of return to intake process, which is described here in D. So that's already a recommendation that occurred a few weeks ago. So I'm just going to sort of take it off the list here for right now. And then sort of focus maybe in on this standardize and expand the use of informal adjustment by DJS. And so I left this as Jenny presented them so that we can look at it and change them collectively. I'd like to start with B. The department over the past few years has submitted legislation to the General Assembly for consideration to remove this victim consent provision for informal adjustments. Oftentimes we have the situation where we're trying to get Target to, or Walmart to consent to an informal adjustment, and they just don't respond. And victims just don't sometimes respond. And then this case gets forwarded to court, and what happens is nothing. Because the victim is not interested and does not come to court, and then the young person doesn't have any intervention. Whereas if we could just pre-court without that formal court process, we may have had an opportunity to sort of promote some positive behavior change. In the legislation that the department has proposed, we did add in language that we would be able to proceed with an informal adjustment without victim consent, as long as all reasonable methods to make contact with the victim were completed. And even so, there is still a appeal process for victims to appeal the decision and the department's decision directly to a state's attorney. So that would still be there if at some point the victim said, oh, I got this too late and we're already proceeding. There is an appeal process that can be utilized. So I would like to make a motion to accept recommendation B with the additional language that with the all efforts to contact the victim have been exhausted.
Is there any objection, Jenny or Nate, to that amendment?
None at all. I had one clarifying question, Betsy.
Okay.
We see not just complaining witnesses appeal these decisions, but we see police officers, especially school police officers in certain counties, appeal decisions to for informal adjustment.
That's correct. Yes. So the victim is one person who can appeal the department's decision. Law enforcement is another.
Okay. All right. I just wanted to clarify.
Mr. Kammerer?
I was just seconding Betsy's motion.
Okay, any discussion on this? This is looking just at B.
I guess my question of the reasonable efforts have been made to contact the victim, but it doesn't change the nature that they need, that we need victim consent. I'm trying to understand the language of saying that we eliminate the requirement of victim consent as long as there's been reasonable efforts to contact the victim. That doesn't tell me that I still need victim consent. Are we saying that we need to try to get victim consent, or are we saying we need to try to contact the victim?
I think we're saying we would need to try to contact the victim to talk to them and gain their consent. What this, I think you make a good point. What this is sort of getting to is the victims that we have no contact with, right? So if we call a victim and they say, no way, I don't want to do an informal adjustment, then we wouldn't be able to do the informal adjustment. If they said, yes, do the informal adjustment, we could do it. If we have no contact with them after trying emails, phone calls, letters, then we would still be able to proceed with an informal adjustment, which is where we see a lot of young people going to court because we've had no contact with the victim. Generally, when we can talk with a victim, we're able to explain, the restorative practices that could be done, other services we can provide to the young person. So I hope that clarifies your question.
I guess as someone who made the motion, like I have a major problem with that. I guess the whole point of this in Part A is that misdemeanors will be diverted. That's the whole point of this, is to say when young people come in. So if I come in on a first time shoplifting now, and I have to, if I've gotten in contact with the victim of the shoplifting and they don't agree, then we wouldn't divert the case. That goes completely in the face of what we're trying to accomplish.
That's not the recommendation from MyJC or us. Our recommendation is to get rid of victim consent, which is not required in adult cases.
Right.
And
right.
Because let's be clear, what you outlined here is what happens all the time, is that our young people complete teen court, do a complete diversion program, and then the complaining witness appeals, and the kid goes to court. So the kid does all the consequences, does all the things that were asked of them, and then faces additional consequences. Our motion is not to exhaust contact, but to get rid of the requirement of victim consent for children that doesn't apply to adults.
This stems from the understanding that we should not have consequences and should not proceed in ways that are disproportionate to the action, and that all the research tells us will get worse results for everyone involved in that situation. It's the whole reason to put forward a motion around diversion. All of this is the understanding that we as a state and we beyond our state do not divert nearly enough young people, given that we get better outcomes from diversion for the young person, for recidivism, et cetera. Sorry, Dr. Sickman.
I was just gonna.
And I want to be true to your recommendation, so I can amend my motion to sort of have it read as this, since that's your recommendation, and we can vote on it from that lens.
Yeah, I was just going to, I mean, you mentioned, Betsy, restorative practices. I don't know where that's ever like in writing, but that there should be maybe victim notification, and that victims should be invited to participate in those restorative sessions if they want to. I mean, I think it's important to give victims a voice, but not veto power.
Mr. Schellenberger, you had a comment?
And actually, I agree with that. And I could definitely get on board with that. But I mean, what we're saying here is that you can divert an assault case. So a 16-year-old beats up a 15-year-old in school, and you don't even have to ask the parents of the 15-year-old how they feel. I mean, it really runs against everything. And Ms. Egan, you are correct. Victims in adult cases don't have veto power, but we are always contacting them. And again, I understand that all jurisdictions are different, but I could go along with something that Dr. Sigmund is mentioning, taking away the victim power, the victim need to consent, but there at least has to be some interaction and some contact.
And if I can just add some context just from what we see when we do reach out to victims, generally victims do agree to informal processes. The one time where I do see victims having a difficulty in agreeing to the informal process is when the restitution's at issue. And that I think is a whole separate issue that definitely needs to either be dealt by future councils or in some manner in the near future, because restitution for young people is incredibly difficult. But we don't see many cases going to court through an appeal from a victim, or just because they don't want the young person to do an informal process. What we do see is a lot of cases going forward to court because there's been just no contact, no follow-up, no ability to reach the victim. So I did change the language on B because I want to present, this is your recommendation, I want to present it as you intended. So that's how it's written now.
I think I take Dr. Sickman and Mr. Schellenberger's point very well. I think that that's a great compromise for us. My question is, I think the requirement for contacting the complaining witness already exists in the statute in another place. So
they'd have to be notified. Absolutely. Notification already exists for the complaining witness.
Yeah. So that voice. Yeah.
Yeah. Reference that. And as is already required, the victims must be contacted And what would be perhaps added is, and here invited to participate in restorative practices through DJS.
I would second that.
Yeah, the involvement of the victim is very important if you want to stay true to a restorative process.
It's important for the youth. It's important for the youth to really, I mean, under balance and restorative justice, which is, you know, in your state purpose clause, it's important for the youth to understand the consequences and the impact that their actions have. Yes, it's important to restorative justice.
So, maybe, Betsy, it's kind of going a little bit back to the original language you had in there, that we have to make the efforts to contact the victims and invite them to engage in restorative practices. But if we cannot, after making those efforts, then we would be able to nevertheless informally adjust the case. Nate, you're muted. You're muted again.
Oh, sorry. I also like this from an equity standpoint in the sense that it makes it establishes a requirement that DJS provide this type of service statewide. That it's not just something that like we have a program in Baltimore, like Restorative Response Baltimore or other places, like to be able to say everywhere around the state when there's been these kinds of conflicts, DJS needs to be able to have this type of service for young people and victims, which is, I think, a good thing to come out of a recommendation from this council.
Betsy, take out the ED on contact.
Thanks, I was gonna say that.
Okay, I think we've got it shaped up into a recommendation. I don't recall where we are in terms of, was it put forward?
I think it was my motion, so I will just, reiterate my motion to accept letter B as written.
Okay.
I'll second it.
Thank you, Scott seconded. Any other discussion? Okay, I'm going to ask if there's any opposition. Please let your opposition or abstention be known. I'm going to assume that Judge Stamm is abstaining, but any opposition to this? Okay, great. We're going to call B.
Sam, I might be able to save you some time. If you go to A and take out second time referrals, just leave it at first. I would vote in favor of that and shut up.
Okay, we have an amendment to A for informal adjustments for all first-time misdemeanor and nonviolent felonies.
Make a motion.
Okay, we have a motion for the amended
Second.
language. It's been seconded. Any discussion?
This is very minor, but you need to put the word referrals back in after the word first.
Okay, any other discussion? All right, any opposition to this? We'll assume Judge Stamm is abstaining. Anyone opposed to the amended language in A? All right. A and B are, highlight those. Passed. Okay.
Could I advance a procedural suggestion?
Absolutely.
We have like another 25 recommendations and we have like 15 minutes until we adjourn. Perhaps we could deputize Jenny and Scott and Betsy and Nate, the four of them, to meet offline and to try to reach consensus on the remaining recommendations so they can present them to us at our next meeting.
I would agree to that. And honestly, Senator West, the remaining ones, I haven't delved into that much, but I think I have much more flexibility in the remaining ones. Ms. Egan, I hope I didn't give you a heart attack.
It's palpitating, but I'm good.
Okay, the chairman is going to accept that recommendation, Senator West. We will put these forward for voting. So we're going to have some work left to do in the last meeting. Voting, and we will also be giving so I'm going to go ahead and just move on to the last piece of our agenda, report drafting and the last meeting. Jamie and his partners at Legislative Services have been busy drafting and have already completed actually first draft of our report. We've sent it back with some comments, and they are working on a second draft. And I believe that once we get that second draft done, it's going to be in good shape to send out to you. And we will send that out. I am anticipating we send it out hopefully with as much time ahead of the next meeting, just understanding that the next meeting is in a week, so that you can review the report as it stands now. And then any additions that we make, if we make additional recommendations on the 17th, we will add right there to the report and hopefully be able to vote. Or if we cannot finish the very last pieces of language, we'll be that close and can send it around for an email up or down on the final report. But we'll have time to look at the majority of the language other than the ones that we have left for the last meeting. I don't believe that I've missed anything else on our agenda today. Is there anything anybody would like to add before we entertain any motions to adjourn?
Mr. Chairman, I would like to apologize for my display of exuberance. And from a moment ago, the reason was I've just found out how many bills are coming to the Judiciary Committee that were pre-filed, and I am beyond excited for the sheer number of bills that are going to be coming to the Judiciary Committee. And I look forward to seeing many of you repeatedly over the next 90 days. Thank you very much. I apologize for that.
All right, Chairman
Luke,
Clippinger.
I thought you had just gotten kicked off this commission, so.
No.
Jenny, let me look at the rest of your list, and then I'll give you a call tomorrow. And Nate, I'll do the
Betsy,
same.
yeah, we can do that. Thanks, Scott.
Okay.
And let me ask a question. There was that second page of stuff that was probation recommendations around, there was stuff around use of evidence-based practices, et cetera. And I had sent in sort of some language around purpose of probation supervision, and we never got to that. So I don't know how important it is, but it was on the table at one point.
Those are certainly things that I think I'll be able to easily agree and insert in there. On those issues, you and I agree a lot.
Okay, you're right, Dr. Sigmund. There are some still remaining issues that I didn't mention, so we will try to corral all of those together and tee them up as efficiently as we can prior to the meeting, along with the final report or the draft of the final report for review. And we'll take up those remaining recommendations at the last meeting.
Should the meeting be longer? I mean, there was a question before, like, why rush, but I know you want to get through stuff. I don't know if that's...
Well, I want to respect everybody's time, and I have been probably the worst offender in asking this group for more time, and in addition to scheduling additional meetings, I think that we can complete the majority of our work that we have, and then if there's any last minute voting on final language, we can do that. I don't want to add any more time. I think there is a lot of work that remains. Not just the work that we are finding unfinished on these issues. There's so much work remaining, and I think that the legislature will probably take that up in some form of fashion of either extending this or creating another committee to take up the issue. I don't know that another hour is going to get us that much further, but I think we'll take it we're going to take it as far as we can. Okay. Any other questions or concerns before we entertain a motion to adjourn? I'll take that motion then.
So moved.
All right. Thanks, everybody, and we'll see you next week.